For over 300 years, the coastlines of England were at the mercy of Barbary pirates from the coast of North Africa, who attacked and plundered the English Channel, Ireland, Scotland and Iceland, capturing over 1 million British men and women into slavery in North Africa. By the early 17th century, the situation was so bad that an entry in the Calendar of State Papers in May 1625 stated, "The Turks are upon our coasts. They take ships, only to take the men to make slaves of them."
Hey, welcome to Dino Reacts, and today we're going to get into the Barbary pirates and the Mediterranean and Atlantic slave trades so we can understand more of the history of the world, better educate ourselves. I'm very curious about what I'm going to learn right now, so as always, let's get after it. Well, let's learn something new today.
Armed with cutlasses, went door to door taking men and women. The coastlines of Europe were no longer safe places to be. The Barbary pirates rocked Europe's most preeminent powers of the maritime, taking people as cargo and rendering coastal defenses useless. A slave trade flourished from this activity, and the impact on the people was unimaginable. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today we examine this.
Before we get deeper into this lesson, I just want to say, I really want to appreciate the times that we're living in, that I get the opportunity to get a deeper education on the history of the world. Not just for debunking narratives and in my case, getting rid of the talk of reparations. I think it's time that we understand that atrocities happened everywhere to all people. And it's important that we have compassion for everybody else instead of looking for handouts, and come together as one human race and not let these types of things happen in the future, or build an army of honorable, God-fearing, spirit-loving people that can combat if these atrocities that are still happening today, because slavery does still exist. But let's learn something new.
Stomach-churning treatment of white slaves by the Barbary pirates. Across the 16th to 19th centuries, pirates from North Africa were joined by Ottoman Empire raiders as they captured and enslaved people across the coastlines of Europe. Called the Barbary Pirates as they operated out of the Barbary Coast, a region of North Africa's coast including modern-day Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, and Algeria. Also known as Corsairs, their main area of operations was in the Mediterranean, hitting coastal towns and formative ports, usually raiding the villages for slaves. Motivated by an opportunity and desire for wealth, the pirates would take the captured back to North Africa for sale, most prominently to the Ottoman Empire. The thousands of enslavements that took place under the pirates were a devastating trauma upon individuals and communities. This effect would be felt in the long term over decades. Make no mistake, the Europeans lived in fear of the rampaging Barbary pirates. So effective and potent were they in their coastal raids, the Barbary pirates can be credited with the start of defensive forts on coastlines and even the development of European navies. The pirates from the coast of North Africa were a force to be reckoned with. Their plunder on the coasts of Europe reached a legendary reputation. Coastal towns and merchant ships for some time were more or less fodder for the well-armed and swift pirate fleets. Writings from around the time give an insight into just how overwhelmed the shores of Europe appeared. Following a raid on the coast of Cornwall in 1625 that captured some 60 men and women into slavery, the Vice Admiral of Devon, Sir John Eliot, would comment, "The seas around England seemed theirs." Raids were commonplace across the 1600s. Ireland's southwest coast of Baltimore was plundered by some 200 pirates, to the tune of 107 Irish natives being captured and taken back to Algiers. By 1640, it was understood some 3,000 to 5,000 English people were captured in Algiers, and a parliamentary committee for the British Parliament was created. The Committee for Algiers set up charities and united local fishing communities to raise money between them to liberate their captured peoples. Evidently, the initial action against the Barbary slave trade didn't take. By 1650, the English fishing industry was under threat. So regular and affecting were the pirate attacks, English fishermen became reluctant to take to the sea and leave their families ashore, vulnerable and unprotected from the potent pirate force. Once captured by the Barbary corsairs, the immediate future was bleak. Surviving the long voyage from Europe back to North Africa was no guarantee. Many would die on the way from a lack of food or water or the onset of disease or illness. Should one survive the mortality-breaching journey, the next stop would be standing at a slave market for hours, being inspected by buyers before the sale at an auction. Accounts for those who had survived being enslaved were wholly telling. Samuel Pepys's diary included accounts of talking to slave survivors of the Barbary trade. In 1661, Pepys's account includes them speaking on how they were given nothing but bread and water to eat, and how they were beaten at liberty on their stomachs and the soles of their feet. Following a purchase, slaves were put to labor and work in a variety of ways. The work of male slaves working the manual labor of...
Isn't it kind of interesting that what the Barbary slaves were doing to the English and the Irish seems eerily similar to what the slave masters of the West Atlantic slave trade and the Americas was doing to African slaves? It's eerily similar, right? But let's continue.
Heavy construction efforts and quarries was the norm. For women enslaved, housework and servitude of the sexual variety was the course. Chillingly, at night, slaves would be kept in overcrowded prisons known as baños. Though laborers or concubines for the...
Baños? Isn't baños the Latin word for bathroom? Baño? Right? I wonder, does that hold the same kind of representation as the word ghetto to Jews? Didn't the Germans used to call where they put Jewish captives during the Holocaust ghettos? And now where black people are living in America in underdeveloped and cheap living, they're also called ghettos. I wonder if there's any correlation in that type of terminology.
Ottoman Empire were hardly fates to be desired. There was one worse fate enforced by the Barbary pirates. Slaves could be assigned to work the oars in the galleys of the very Barbary ships plundering and bringing back slaves to Africa. Shackled to their seats, slaves turned rowers were never allowed to leave. Astonishingly, this meant a life almost in its entirety consigned to sitting at an oar. Eating, sleeping, urinating, and defecating all took place at the position of the oar. Be assured, in this inhumane setting, any lapse, slip, or sign of insubordination was met with a whip across the back. The Barbary slave trade would be felt far and wide, even crossing over the rich literary culture of the time. The author of the iconic novel Don Quixote, Miguel de Cervantes himself, was captured and enslaved by the pirates from 1575 to 1580. It would take a raised ransom from the Trinitarian Catholics and his parents for him to be a free man again. After enough people went missing, fishing industries were tanking, and budding navies felt humiliated. The powers of Europe would strike back. Across the 17th to 19th centuries, the western states whose coastal towns had been under siege would wage war with the Barbary pirates. The United States went to war with the Barbary states not once, but twice. The first was fought against the Barbary states of North Africa from 1801 to 1805. The second war would come 10 years later. In 1816, a brief war with the Barbary state of
How come we were never really taught about the American naval military fighting against the North African slave traders? Was it because at the exact same time we had slaves? So we don't want to say that we're fighting against the enslavement of Europeans while also enslaving Western Africans? Listen, I am one to not really want to get into CTR or critical race theory, because I think like teaching victimhood or teaching hate of anyone is a bad thing. But you got to at least share this part of the history. Yes, it's going to be a black eye. You couldn't be fighting against the enslavement of Europeans while also enslaving West Africans at the same time. But then what also comes to play is America did fight a civil war. So while the northern Americans were fighting against slavery, the Southern Americans were fighting for it. That would create some deep, dark dissensions. That created some deep wars. Wow. Learn something every day, or ding, the points start crossing in the brain a little bit.
Algiers would encapsulate the state of naval politics at the time. Following this war with Algiers, the U.S. would end its tribute payments, which were supposed to protect the U.S. from pirate attacks. The European coasts would also gather forces and mount attacks on the...
Wait, let me get this straight. So we were also paying tribute payments to pirates so they wouldn't attack us?
Pirate states. In 1675, with a Royal Navy squadron behind him, Sir John Narborough was able to negotiate at least a temporary peace with Tunis. British bombardment was the method chosen to bring peace with Tripoli also. Yet the fighting over supremacy of the seas would continue over the coming centuries. Algiers would be a focal point of the conflict, attacked from the sea by French, Spanish, British, and yes, American warships. 1816 appears a seminal and conclusive year for the War on the Barbary Pirates. Amidst war with the U.S., an attack from Dutch and British fleets led to the liberation of over 4,000 Christian slaves, and finally, the Barbary Corsairs were in decline from then on. Ultimately, the legacy of the Barbary Pirates is not a simple matter. The power and efficiency they had, the dominance they showed over the Maritime's most potent forces, have been both romanticized and vilified across history. What is undebatable is the impact their raids and slave trading had over the people and regions they targeted. The legacy of the Barbary Pirates is a remarkable one and an insight into the world at the time oft forgotten. While the Barbary slave trade would lose steam from the 17th century and would be essentially disbanded following the French conquest of Algiers in 1830, its impact was profound, yet also timely. The slave trade of the Barbary states is hand in hand with the 16th to 19th century Atlantic slave trade. While rarely spoken, this is context. The Barbary slave trade was an arm of the Ottoman Empire. At a time where empires were warring in the maritime, taking slaves was a grim part of the battle for global supremacy. Across their 4 active centuries as slavers, some academics estimate that the number of Europeans enslaved by the Barbary Corsairs likely tops over 1 million. There can be no clean comparison between the Atlantic slave trade and the Barbary slave trade, however. People captured as slaves by the Barbary pirates were to be sold in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. This being said, the Corsairs also enslaved people of color and non-Christian whites from Eastern Europe. It was not a clear-cut case of Muslim and African enslavement of Christian whites, as the reverse can be true of the Atlantic slave trade. Furthermore, there are many instances of the Corsairs' most effective operators being European. Many of the most notorious Barbary pirates were privateers from Europe who sailed to the Barbary coast in peacetime, purely to earn a pocket independently. Outcast European renegades were able to bring the most current naval knowledge to the Barbary slave trade, explaining raids as far from North Africa as Newfoundland and Iceland. Last but not least, parallels between the Barbary and Atlantic slave trade divorce radically in terms of outcomes. Typically, slaves of the Barbary trade could be sold to wealthy individuals and families in the Ottoman Empire, converted to Islam, and afforded an affluent education, and a chance at respected roles in the royal guard or harem. The Atlantic slave trade left no such chance of social mobility or chances of elevation for the individual. Surviving the Middle Passage was trauma, followed by years of trauma. Finally, slavery is slavery. Either trade is littered with continual instances of sexual slavery and woeful record and decimating women's autonomy. Curiously, despite the Atlantic and Barbary slave trades having a similar timeline, the European perceptions of North Africa and the Muslim world were indelibly dented. European literature and art would reinforce negative stereotypes about the people in the region. To this day, we can witness the long-standing miscomprehension and conflict between Europe and North Africa and the Muslim world, and how this continues to shape cultural attitudes and global politics. This is...
All right. Well, I think this video pretty much speaks for itself. It's definitely very interesting. Very.
Well, I would like to say, this journey of understanding true history, not just my American-born history, has been a great experience, and I'm happy to that you guys are coming along this journey with me. We are here to topple the old age and deep state understanding of trying to always keep us separate, in war, unhappy, impoverished. We want a state of prosperity and to restore the golden light on the hill, which can be the United States of America. And we must first by understanding our history. And I pledge that going forward, if I hear anybody bullying anybody of European descent about slavery, I'm going to remind them of the Barbary pirates in the Ottoman Empire and realize bad things happen to everyone. But it's up to us as righteous, just humans to make that change. Because change doesn't have a color, peace doesn't have a color, and love doesn't have a color. Respect doesn't have a color. So we can all participate in it together. So let's help each other, learn more history, and become better people every single day. Once again, thank you guys for watching Dino Reacts. And if you like my content, like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, chef's kiss. Mwah.